Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is not just a story, it's a confession, a warning, and a reckoning. Imagine waking up one morning to find that the place you loved most in the world, the lake you grew up beside, the lake that carried your childhood memories, your peace, your solitude, had been stolen. Not by strangers, not by the government, but by the very people who claim to protect your community. The Homeowners Association, the HOA, decided they had the right to build a power plant on my lake. My lake. They thought they could take what was mine, what was sacred, and turn it into their machine. They thought I would stay silent. They thought wrong. Because what they didn't know was that I had been waiting, watching, planning. And when the night came, I drained the water. Every drop. Overnight. And when they saw what I had done, they panicked. But that was only the beginning. I remember the first time I saw the construction equipment roll in. The sound of engines tearing through the silence of dawn, the smell of diesel choking the air that used to carry the scent of pine and fresh water. They didn't ask me. They didn't ask anyone. They simply declared it was for the greater good. They said the lake was underutilized, that it could power homes, businesses, the entire neighborhood. But I knew the truth. It wasn't about power for the community. It was about control. It was about money. It was about them proving they could take whatever they wanted. And as I stood there, watching them drive steel into the earth, I felt something inside me snap. The lake had always been my sanctuary. I used to sit by its edge at night, listening to the water lap against the shore, watching the moon ripple across its surface. It was where I went when I needed to think, when I needed to breathe. It was where I buried my secrets, my pain, my rage. And now they were poisoning it. They were turning it into a machine, a monster. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let that happen. At first, I tried to fight them the way anyone would. I went to meetings. I raised my voice. I told them the lake wasn't theirs to take. But every time I spoke, they silenced me. They smiled their fake smiles, nodded their heads, and then voted against me. They laughed at me. They dismissed me. And with every rejection, with every smirk, the fire inside me grew hotter. They thought they had won. They thought I was powerless, but they didn't know me. They didn't know what I was capable of. I started watching them. I learned their routines, their weaknesses. I studied the plant they were building, every pipe, every valve, every lock. I memorized the sound of their footsteps, the way they carried themselves, the way they underestimated me. I became invisible, a shadow moving through their world. And as I watched, I began to see the cracks, the arrogance of their design, the fragility of their system. They thought they had built something indestructible, but I knew better. I knew how to break it. The night I drained the lake, the air was heavy with silence. The moon hung low, casting its pale light across the water. I moved like a ghost, my hands steady, my heart pounding. I found the valve, the one they thought no one would ever touch. I turned it slowly, feeling the resistance, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. And then the water began to move. At first it was a trickle, a whisper, but then it grew louder, stronger, until it was a roar. The lake was bleeding out, pouring itself into the earth, vanishing into the darkness. I stood there, watching it drain, watching my revenge take shape. By morning, the lake was gone. The power plant stood exposed, its foundations sinking into mud, its machines choking on air. The HOA members arrived, their faces pale, their voices trembling. They didn't know what to do. They panicked. They screamed at each other, pointing fingers, blaming anyone but themselves. They had built their empire on water, and now the water was gone. And I watched them crumble. I watched them realize that they were not in control. I was. But draining the lake was only the first step. My revenge was not complete. I wanted them to feel what I had felt. The loss, the rage, the helplessness. I wanted them to know that every decision they made had consequences, that every act of greed carried a price. So I began to haunt them. I left notes on their doors, messages carved into wood, whispers in the night. I reminded them of what they had done, of what they had lost.
I made them afraid to sleep, afraid to wake, afraid to breathe. They tried to fight back. They called meetings, hired guards, installed cameras, but none of it mattered. I was always one step ahead. I knew their secrets, their fears, their lies. I knew how to twist the knife, how to make them doubt each other, how to make them turn on themselves. And as they tore each other apart, I stood in the shadows, smiling. The suspense grew with every passing day. They didn't know who was behind it. They didn't know how I drained the lake. They didn't know how I kept slipping past their defenses. They only knew that someone was out there, someone who wanted revenge, someone who would not stop until they were destroyed. And that fear consumed them. It ate away at their sanity, their pride, their power. I remember the moment one of them broke down, screaming in the middle of a meeting, accusing the others of betrayal. His voice cracked, his hands shook, his eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. And I knew then that I had won. Not because the lake was gone, not because the plant was ruined, but because they were broken. They had built their empire on my pain, and now I had built my revenge on theirs. This story is not about justice. It's not about the authorities stepping in or the law taking its course. This story is about me, about what happens when you push someone too far, when you take what is theirs and expect them to stay silent. This story is about revenge, pure and unrelenting. And as I sit here telling you what I did, I want you to understand one thing. I don't regret it, not for a second. The lake may be gone, but so is their power, and in its place, there is silence, a silence that belongs to me, a silence that reminds them every day of what they lost, of what I took, of what I destroyed. They thought they could control me, they thought they could own me, but now they know the truth. I am the one who owns them. And as you listen to this story, as you feel the suspense, the fear, the rage, I want you to ask yourself, what would you do if they took everything from you? Would you fight? Would you surrender? Or would you wait, watch, and strike when they least expect it? Because sometimes revenge is the only justice left, and sometimes silence is the loudest scream of all.
The days after the lake drained were chaos. The HOA members scrambled like ants whose hill had been kicked apart. They brought in engineers, consultants, even lawyers, but none of them could explain how the water had vanished overnight. They whispered about sabotage, about enemies, about curses. I watched them from the shadows, savoring their confusion. Every meeting they held was louder, more desperate, more fractured. They were losing control, and I was tightening the noose. But I wasn't finished. The lake was gone, yes, but the power plant still stood, a hollow skeleton of steel and concrete. I wanted it to collapse, not just physically, but symbolically. I wanted them to see their empire crumble piece by piece until they understood the weight of what they had done to me. So I began my second act. At night, I crept into the plant. The guards they hired were lazy, half asleep, convinced no one would dare return after the disaster. I moved silently, my footsteps blending with the hum of machines that were now useless without water. I tampered with wires, loosened bolts, left small traces of destruction that would grow into disasters. I didn't want it to fall all at once. I wanted it to rot from the inside, to betray them slowly, to make them doubt their own creation. The suspense grew with every malfunction. A turbine that refused to start, a generator that sparked and smoked, a control panel that flickered and died. They blamed each other, accused the contractors, cursed the engineers. But deep down, they knew. Someone was out there. Someone was dismantling their dream. And the fear of not knowing who it was gnawed at them more than the failures themselves. I remember one night vividly. I stood outside the plant, watching the lights flicker like dying stars. The air was thick with the smell of burning wires, and I could hear the shouts of panic inside. One of the board members stormed out, his face pale, his hands trembling. He looked around wildly, as if expecting to see me standing there. And for a moment, I wanted to step into the light, to let him see me, to let him know exactly who was behind it all. But I didn't. Not yet. The suspense was sweeter than the reveal. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to turn against them. The promises of cheap power, of progress, of prosperity had vanished with the lake. People were angry, confused, betrayed. They demanded answers, demanded accountability, and the HOA, once so smug and untouchable, found themselves cornered. They tried to spin lies, to blame nature, to claim it was an accident, but no one believed them. Their empire was crumbling, and I was the invisible hand pushing it down. I didn't stop with the plant. I wanted them to feel hunted, haunted. I left footprints in places I shouldn't have been. I rearranged objects in their offices, their homes. I carved messages into wood, into stone, into metal. Simple words, but powerful. I see you. You can't hide. This is your fault. Every time they found one, their fear deepened. They began to look over their shoulders, to jump at shadows, to question each other. Suspicion spread like wildfire, consuming their trust, their unity. One of them broke first. He resigned, claiming illness, but I knew the truth. He couldn't take it anymore. The sleepless nights, the paranoia, the guilt, it had eaten him alive. And as he walked away, I felt a surge of satisfaction. This was my revenge, not through violence, not through law, but through fear. I was dismantling them from within, turning their own minds against them. But I wasn't done. I wanted a climax, a final act that would leave them shattered beyond repair. I began to plan something bigger, something that would make the draining of the lake look like a whisper compared to the scream I was about to unleash. The HOA was unraveling faster than even I had imagined. Their meetings had turned into shouting matches, their members were resigning one by one, and the plant itself was becoming a graveyard of broken machinery. But I wasn't satisfied yet. I wanted them to feel the weight of their arrogance pressing down on them until they couldn't breathe. I wanted them to know that every step they took was being watched, every decision they made was being poisoned by the knowledge that I was out there, waiting. I began to target them individually. Each member had their own weakness, their own secret, their own fear. One of them prided himself on his pristine home, his manicured lawn, his perfect image. I slipped into his yard at night and tore up the grass, leaving muddy footprints across his porch. Another was obsessed with security, with locks and alarms. I bypassed them all, leaving a single chair overturned in his living room, a silent reminder that his fortress was nothing more than paper walls. The suspense grew with each act. They didn't know how I was getting in, how I was finding them, how I was always one step ahead. They began to suspect each other, whispering accusations, planting seeds of doubt. Their unity shattered, their trust dissolved, and I watched, savoring every crack, every fracture. One night, I followed the HOA president. He was the one who'd pushed hardest for the plant, the one who dismissed me with a smirk, the one who said, "It's just a lake." He drove late into the night, his headlights cutting through the darkness, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. I stayed behind him, far enough to remain unseen, close enough to feel his fear. He knew someone was watching. He knew someone was coming. I left him a message the next morning, carved on the hood of his car. It was never just a lake. His scream echoed through the neighborhood, a sound of pure rage and terror, and I smiled, because now he understood. The plant continued to fail. Pipes burst, wires snapped, foundations cracked. Every time they tried to fix it, something else went wrong. It was as if the lake itself was haunting them, as if the spirit of the water was exacting revenge. But it wasn't the lake. It was me. I was the ghost in their machine, the shadow in their world, the hand pulling them down.
The neighborhood grew restless. People demanded answers, demanded resignations, demanded justice. And the HOA, once so smug and untouchable, found themselves cornered. They tried to spin lies, to blame nature, to claim it was an accident. But no one believed them. Their empire was crumbling, and I was the invisible hand pushing it down. I didn't stop with the plant. I wanted them to feel hunted, haunted. I left footprints in places I shouldn't have been. I rearranged objects in their offices, their homes. I carved messages into wood, into stone, into metal. Simple words, but powerful. I see you. You can't hide. This is your fault. Every time they found one, their fear deepened. They began to look over their shoulders, to jump at shadows, to question each other. Suspicion spread like wildfire, consuming their trust, their unity. One of them broke first. He resigned, claiming illness, but I knew the truth. He couldn't take it anymore. The sleepless nights, the paranoia, the guilt, it had eaten him alive. And as he walked away, I felt a surge of satisfaction. This was my revenge, not through violence, not through law, but through fear. I was dismantling them from within, turning their own minds against them. But I wasn't done. I wanted a climax, a final act that would leave them shattered beyond repair. I began to plan something bigger, something that would make the draining of the lake look like a whisper compared to the scream I was about to unleash.
The HOA president was unraveling faster than the rest. His pride had been built on the illusion of control, and now that illusion was shattered. He barely slept, his eyes hollow, his voice trembling whenever he spoke. I could see the cracks spreading through him, and I knew he would be the perfect centerpiece for my final act. I began to orchestrate the climax carefully, deliberately. I wanted it to be more than sabotage, more than fear. I wanted it to be a spectacle, something that would leave the entire neighborhood in awe and terror. So I set my plan into motion. First, I planted rumors. Anonymous letters slipped under doors, whispers carried through the streets, stories of betrayal and corruption. I made sure everyone knew the HOA had lied, had stolen, had destroyed the lake for their own greed. The community's anger grew, their patience snapped. They demanded answers, demanded blood, and the HOA, already fractured, began to collapse under the weight of public fury. Then I struck at the plant one last time. I waited until the night was silent, until the guards had grown complacent, until the moon was high. I moved through the shadows, every step rehearsed, every breath steady. I reached the heart of the plant, the control room, the place where their empire lived and died, and there I unleashed chaos. Wires ripped, panels shattered, alarms screamed into the night. The plant convulsed, its machines tearing themselves apart, its foundations trembling under the strain. By morning, it was nothing but ruins. Steel twisted, concrete cracked, smoke rising into the sky like a funeral pyre. The neighborhood gathered, their eyes wide, their voices hushed. They saw the empire that had stolen their lake reduced to rubble, and they knew it was no accident. They knew someone had done this. Someone had taken revenge. The HOA president stood among the ruins, his face pale, his hands shaking. He tried to speak, tried to rally them, but his voice broke, his words faltered. And then I stepped forward. For the first time, I revealed myself. I let them see me, let them know exactly who had brought them down. It was never just a lake, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. It was mine, and you thought you could take it. But now, look at what you've lost. Look at what I've taken from you. The crowd gasped. The HOA members recoiled. The president collapsed into silence. They understood now. They understood that their greed had consequences, that their arrogance had birthed their destruction. And I stood there, unbroken, victorious, the architect of their downfall. The suspense lingered even after the plant was gone. The neighborhood whispered my name, half in fear, half in awe. The HOA dissolved, its members scattered, its power shattered. And I remained,
the shadow that had risen against them, the voice of vengeance, the hand of justice. I didn't need the authorities. I didn't need the law. I had taken my revenge with my own hands, and it was complete. The lake was gone, but so was their empire, and in its place there was silence, a silence that belonged to me, a silence that would echo forever. The ruins of the plant smoldered for days, a blackened skeleton against the horizon, a reminder of arrogance turned to ash. The neighborhood whispered in hushed tones, afraid to speak too loudly, as if my presence lingered in the air. Children avoided the sight, parents pulled them close, and every passerby felt the weight of silence pressing down. The HOA members who remained tried to salvage their reputations, but the community no longer trusted them. Their words were hollow, their promises broken, their power gone. I watched them scatter. One sold his house and fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind furniture, photographs, fragments of a life he could no longer bear to live. Another drowned himself in drink, stumbling through the streets, muttering about shadows and voices. The president, once so smug, now walked with his head bowed, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting nervously at every sound. He had become a ghost of himself, haunted by the memory of the lake, by the ruin of the plant, by the knowledge that I had destroyed him. The suspense did not end with the destruction. It lived on in their paranoia, in their sleepless nights, in the way they jumped at the creak of a floorboard or the slam of a door. I had become more than a person to them. I was a specter, a force, a reminder that their greed had consequences, and I reveled in it. But in the quiet moments, when the neighborhood slept and the ruins lay still, I felt something deeper, a silence that was both victory and emptiness. The lake was gone, drained into the earth, never to return. My sanctuary had been destroyed, and though I had taken everything from them, I could not bring back what I had lost. I stood at the edge of the dry basin, the cracked earth stretching before me, and I wondered if I had won or if I had simply traded one loss for another. The whispers of the community grew into legends. They spoke of me as if I were more than human, as if I were a spirit of the lake itself, rising to punish those who dared to desecrate it. Some feared me, some admired me, but all remembered me, and that was enough. The HOA dissolved completely. No meetings, no votes, no power. The members vanished, their names cursed, their deeds remembered only as warnings. The neighborhood lived in uneasy peace, always aware that I was still there, watching, waiting. They never tried to rebuild the plant, never touched the lake again. And I remained, the shadow at the edge of their world, the voice of vengeance, the hand of justice. My revenge was complete, but my presence lingered, a reminder carved into the bones of the community. They would never forget what I had done. They would never forget that when they stole my lake, I stole their empire. Sometimes, late at night, I walk across the dry basin, the moonlight casting long shadows across the cracked earth. I listen to the silence, to the absence of water, to the echo of what once was. It is mine now, this silence, this emptiness. My revenge has become my legacy, my presence etched into the bones of the community. And as long as they live in fear, as long as they remember, I will never truly be gone. The silence after the plant's destruction was not peace, it was tension stretched thin, a wire humming in the dark. The HOA members who once strutted through the neighborhood now moved like shadows, their voices hushed, their eyes hollow. Each one carried the weight of guilt and fear, and I made sure that weight grew heavier with every passing day. I began to dismantle them one by one, not with violence, but with precision. The treasurer who had pocketed funds meant for community projects found his accounts mysteriously drained. Every dollar he had hidden was gone, vanished into the same void where the lake had disappeared. He screamed at the bank, at his family, at himself, but no one could help him. He had stolen from the community, and now the community whispered that the lake had stolen back. The secretary who had mocked me during meetings woke each morning to find her home altered, a chair moved, a window unlocked, a mirror cracked. She began to doubt her own sanity, wondering if she had done it herself, wondering if the house was alive. I left her a single note on her kitchen table. You laughed at me. Who's laughing now? She never returned to another meeting. The president was the hardest to break, but also the most satisfying. He clung to the remnants of his power, trying to convince himself that he could rebuild, that he could rise again. But I knew his weakness, his pride. I began to chip away at it, leaving reminders everywhere he turned. His car wouldn't start, his office was vandalized, his speeches interrupted by whispers in the crowd. And then, one night, I stood outside his window, my silhouette framed by the moonlight. He saw me, and in that moment, he knew. He knew I was the one who had drained the lake, the one who had destroyed the plant, the one who had haunted him. His scream echoed through the empty streets, a sound of pure defeat. The neighborhood watched all of this unfold with a mix of fear and awe. They whispered about me, some calling me a monster, others calling me a savior. Children dared each other to walk near the dry basin at night, claiming they could hear the lake's ghost. Parents pulled them close, and every passerby felt the weight of silence pressing down. My presence had become a legend, my revenge a story that would outlive us all. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the neighborhood slept and the ruins lay still, I felt something deeper. A silence that was both victory and emptiness. The lake was gone, drained into the earth, never to return. My sanctuary had been destroyed, and though I had taken everything from them, I could not bring back what I had lost. I stood at the edge of the dry basin, the cracked earth stretching before me, and I wondered if I had won, or if I had simply traded one loss for another. Still, I knew one thing. They would never forget me. The HOA was gone, dissolved into nothing, its members broken, its empire shattered. The community lived in uneasy silence, always aware that I was still there, watching, waiting. They never dared to build again, never dared to steal again. My revenge had become their law, my silence their punishment. And as I walked away from the ruins, the night air heavy with whispers, I smiled, because though the lake was gone, the silence is mine. It is my victory, my legacy, my revenge. And as long as they live in fear, as long as they remember, I will never truly be gone. The final part of the story unfolds not with explosions or chaos, but with silence that cuts deeper than any sound. The HOA was gone,